And I'm going to get Troy up here as soon as possible so that we can have a good, full conversation. As you know, Troy Dostert has a PhD in political theory from Duke University. His dissertation was published without revision by the University of Notre Dame Press. His work has been on the interaction between liberal principles and religious beliefs and practices. And his work has been was groundbreaking when he initially published his dissertation. For reasons that I think we can only be grateful to God for, he has chosen to spend most of his career teaching at Cranbrook schools. And that's an incredible sacrifice of an incredible intellect. And I am so grateful to have someone with his background and thoughtfulness to teach here as part of what we do at Christ Church Cranbrook. Will you join me in thanking and welcoming Troy to the podium?
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. This is exciting. And I've got a lot to share with you. I do have to say one thing right off the bat, though. Bill's intro, I appreciate that intro, Bill, but nobody publishes a book without substantial revisions. So that was an excruciating, well, depends on your perspective, I guess. Yeah, I was actually finishing up the process of getting that book published when I started teaching at Cranbrook. And, this is the first and only book I've ever published, so I had no concept of how much work that would be, and I still have fond memories of spending my first Thanksgiving break going through the index, and what a delight that was. Yeah, can't begin to tell you. So that was back in 2005. So it has been quite a while since I've had a chance to think systematically about the question of the church's role in public life, and so the opportunity to do this has been valuable for me. And so I've done a lot of thinking about this. And my own perspective has changed a bit since I formulated these ideas back in the 90s and early 2000s. And some of that I'll have a chance to share with you, I think, in session 3. That'll be a little bit after we've surveyed the historical landscape. And then at that point, we'll have a chance a couple weeks from now to do some reflection on the norms and the ideals and guidelines that we should have as a community in thinking about engaging the wider world. So what we're going to do is use the historical context, going all the way back to the colonial period and the founding period in the 18th century, and then that'll be today. And then next week we'll go into the 19th century, which will involve talking about the abolitionist struggle and Reconstruction, that pivotal 10-year or so period right after the Civil War, when America was trying to figure out how to empower and give rights to African Americans. And then we're also going to talk about the women's suffrage movement next week as well, and then that'll bring us up to the present. We'll talk a little bit about the abortion controversy a couple weeks from now, and that's kind of timely, of course, as we've got a proposal coming up on the Michigan ballot, which is one of those opportunities where citizens can weigh in directly on a fundamental rights question. So interesting times that we live in, troubling times, for sure, that we live in. In fact, just this morning, as I was reading the New York Times, the lead article, some of you may have seen this, is about the devil terms that have become commonplace in public discourse because, it's become a pastime for a lot of politicians to describe their adversaries as being in league with Satan. No better way to win votes in some quarters of our population than to suggest that they are part of a satanic conspiracy. And I admit, there's moments when I'll read an article like this, and it's dismaying. It is depressing, and I think to myself, wouldn't it be great if all the Christians in America could just get together and agree to shut up for a while, okay? Just remain silent. And there are moments when I think that's a pretty defensible posture for Christians to take in public life. But if that were the case, then these sessions would be very brief indeed. I am going to actually be arguing that Christians have a vital role to play in public life, but that there are some parameters that we should have in mind when when that happens. So that's a lot of what we're going to be aiming toward when we get further along here, especially in session 3. But today, again, we're talking about the historical landscape. I am not intending in these sessions to resolve some of our most fraught public questions. I'm not going to tell you how to vote on Proposal 3. And partly, again, because I don't see my role here as coming to nice, easy, facile solutions for some of these questions. These are complicated questions. They're political all the way down. And I think one thing that you'll see from all the historical episodes that we consider is that politics is always at the root of these questions to define rights. It's never as simple as to say, well, we have a right to religious freedom, therefore we do this, all right? Or we have a right to freedom of conscience, or we have a right to freedom of speech, therefore we do this. These rights have always been a battleground. That's the truth of the matter. So in that sense, the kind of stuff that we're experiencing on a regular basis nowadays may be a little more extreme, maybe a little more intense and divisive than in times past, but not necessarily. You know, there was a civil war fought over the question of the equality of human beings. So we've been through this before, and maybe I'll provide some resources that can help us think of how we can steer through our present dilemmas. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, what I want to do right off the bat is present 2 ways in which the church has contributed to public purposes. Okay, and the first of those is by providing a language, a vision, a theologically rooted way of understanding the dignity of human beings and the rights that we should possess as people. And that's, when you think of public arguments and you think of public discourse, this is the way in which the church makes its case for why we should have rights and what those rights should entail. And a perfect example of this is if we look at the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident: all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, that's from Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. If you ask most Americans, if you take that passage out of context and read it for them and say, where does this come from? Most of them are going to say, oh, that's from the Constitution. Right? And most of my students will say that as well. Oh, yeah, that's in the Constitution. And you explain to them, no, it's not in the Constitution. In fact, it would have been absurd in some ways for the Constitution to have that expression in it, because the Constitution, as designed in 1787, was a document that protected slavery. It only has its present meaning for us. Certainly didn't have the meaning that all men are literally equal, not in Thomas Jefferson's time, because Thomas Jefferson was one of the wealthiest slaveholders in Virginia. He certainly didn't mean that. It was a reference to a natural rights tradition and an idea that we have political rights, some of us, and it was an attempt to embody that. Its meaning has changed over time. Its meaning has changed over time because Abraham Lincoln did a lot of work with the Declaration of Independence in moments like the Gettysburg Address, for instance, where he describes the Civil War as an attempt to give life to this promise, to this proposition that all men are created equal. Martin Luther King Jr. did a lot to give life to this passage and to give it meaning. And Christian churches have done a lot over time to give life and to put flesh on the bones, right? We have a proposition here that has been redefined historically, and Christians have played a vital role in doing that. What it means to say that all men are created equal. Well, let's figure out how that works. So that is no doubt a pivotal part of what we are talking about when we talk about the church's role in public life. There is another aspect, though, that often gets forgotten about when we talk about politics and we talk about discourse and we talk about civic arguments and things like that. And that is the role that the church plays as its own model community when it is at its best. And it can put forth examples of how we can live our life in common. This doesn't necessarily have anything directly to do with public argumentation. The church brings this ideal about when it lives up to its best ideals, when it can instantiate, when it can give a life to its fundamental claims and do that in a powerful way. It can amplify its public arguments by pointing to an example of the reality that we all aspire to as Christians. We are reminded, therefore, that we are created by God not solely as rights-bearing individuals, but much more fundamentally as social beings. We are created by God to depend on one another in community. And that is something that a rights language simply does not fully embody. Rights are used to protect you from other people, from the government, and we tend to think of rights-bearing individuals as precisely that, individuals who are endeavoring to fend off a threat of some kind, either a threat imposed by the government or, again, our fellow citizens, right? And so we think of rights principally have had a negative connotation in that sense, not negative as in undesirable, but something you're trying to avoid. And what the church at its best does is remind us that, in fact, we are beings who are created by God to depend deeply on one another. And a rights language, in some ways, can actually get in the way of that. And so part of what the church has brought to the table in public discourse is to remind us that while rights are important, they're not all that's important. And there are some things that are more significant, that are more substantial even than rights. So our social context as Christians is a really, really vital one for us to remember. And you can see examples of this throughout history, but I think my favorite is the civil rights movement. One of my most, I think the chapter in my dissertation that I was most proud of was certainly the one devoted to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. I looked not only at his rhetoric and the way in which King transformed public ideals, like the idea of human equality, but the way in which the African American church was at the center of the struggle for civil rights change in the 50s and 60s. There were over 100 church burnings throughout the South in the 50s and 60s, and that was not by accident. White supremacists knew that the church was the foundation of the racial change that was taking place in the South. And so the church burnings that took place, and sometimes church bombings that took place, as in the one that took place in Birmingham in 1963, killed the 4 little girls. That was intentional as a way to inflict terror in the African American church, because that was the home base for change in the 50s and 60s. Another example that I love to point to is Freedom Summer from 1964, where you had white and black and Latino college students coming from all over the country converging on Mississippi to try to bring about a changed social reality there. Their interracial activism scared the heck out of white supremacists. I mean, it's one thing to have black people arguing for their rights, right? And that could be easily dismissed by the white supremacist in the South. But to have whites joining the cause, this was not tolerable. So the Freedom Rides, where those buses were bombed during their interstate travel throughout the South in 1961, or the Freedom Summer movement in 1964, those were frightening to white supremacists because it was a sign that the racial order was changing. The new basis of community that was taking shape, white and black working side by side, was more than white supremacists could handle. That was too much, and so they had to respond with violence. Powerful moments where it's the sociality of the church, it's the communal context in which we live that is so pivotal here. And we have examples of that every week right here at Christ Church, right? If we're baptizing someone, that's a reminder that that child or that adult is not an independent entity. They are part of a community, right? That embrace is a pivotal part of that ceremony. The same thing happens when people are married. They're part of a community, right? That married couple does not stand alone in the world to face the challenges of married life. They have companionship, right? And they're part of a community. And of course, every week when we celebrate the Eucharist, that is the moment where we're reminded that we're invited to a table that includes all of God's people. And those powerful moments should anchor the church's public life. If we are presenting our convictions faithfully and with integrity in the public realm, we have to remind ourselves of those moments that transcend rights, right? And point to something even more fulfilling and theologically rich than simply the idea that we're individual rights bearers, although we are that, right? So those are the two roles that I see the church playing out historically. One is to define public purposes, to give a vision of public purposes and what our rights are, what our obligations are to each other, and then to fulfill this vision in a social life that is rich and meaningful and anchored in our faith tradition. So those are the two principles that we're going to see at work in the next few sessions, okay? So what I want to do next is I want to talk a little bit about colonial America, and let me bring this up here. Here we have a map of the religious landscape. It's not a perfect map, but it does a pretty good job of conveying the religious diversity that was in place by 1750 or so. I think I might have to take this out. Okay. So right from the start, and I mean right from the 1600s, early 1600s, when Jamestown was started as a colony, when the settlement at Plymouth took place a little bit later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and so forth. 1620s and 1630s, you had a lot of religious diversity in the colonies, okay? You will notice that there is an Anglican presence, quite a large Anglican presence throughout the colonies. All the green areas here are Anglican dominated, and that's not surprising, right? Because of course the Church of England was sponsoring colonial America, and Anglicanism was the established church in a lot of places, including Virginia and elsewhere. But you have a lot of diversity that has already taken place by that point as well. Not only have you had the Congregationalists, the descendants of Puritans, dominating New England, you also got a Lutheran presence scattered throughout the colonies. Some other Calvinists, the Presbyterians, have also made some inroads by the mid-18th century. And then other groups. We have Baptists scattered throughout the colonies by the 1750s. We have a Catholic presence in a number of places, especially in Maryland, starting to form in New York as well. And then you have a bunch of other Reformed Protestant churches. This is a bewildering landscape of religious diversity by the 1750s. One of the contributing factors to this is the Great Awakening. So starting in the 1730s and continuing really through the 1760s, you have a number of religious revivals that are breaking out. One carried out famously by an Anglican, George Whitefield, who came over from England several times to try to stir up religious passion in the colonies and give people a conversion experience, the confidence that God's grace had come upon them. And his counterpart in New England was Jonathan Edwards, famously composing the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which I always share with my students, and which absolutely, well, it kind of frightens them, but mostly it's just bizarre and strange, right? It's like, why would anybody spend this long talking about hell, okay? And how could there be any good news in that at all? Of course, for Jonathan Edwards, of course, it's tremendous news because you get to avoid all of this. You just have to come to Jesus, you know. But that's a tough sell to young people nowadays. Boy, why in the world would anybody find this inspiring and enlightening? But it was, and it totally transformed the religious landscape. So that by 1750, it's a crazy quilt of religious diversity, and therefore, when we think, well, you know, America's always had a Christian foundation, and there's some truth to that historically. There are Jewish communities here. There are other religious movements here and there. But for the most part, there is a Christian commonality in the 18th century. But when you look at the diversity of doctrines and the diversity of practices in these various communities, you have to appreciate just how crazily diverse religion was in the 18th century. And of course, that just continues as we go. And so even though that diversity is a challenge, it certainly makes it harder for people to see each other as part of a common faith, and it makes politics very challenging at times. It's also an opportunity. It's important to appreciate the way in which religious freedom, as one of our core American rights, comes about precisely because of this crazy diversity. Right? Colonists had to learn to get along with people of very different kinds of convictions. And some of those new movements that started up as a result of the Great Awakening, and I'm thinking here specifically of the Baptists and the Methodists, two movements that really took off like wildfire in the mid-18th century. Those communities were often persecuted, sometimes by their Anglican Christian counterparts, sad to say. Virginia was a great example of this. The Baptist communities that took life there in the mid-18th century were often treated horribly. by their Christian counterparts, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were paying close attention to this. They were mortified by this. And as a result, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, one of Thomas Jefferson's proudest accomplishments, was created as a way to protect some of those persecuted minorities in places like Virginia. And then the First Amendment to the Constitution, of course, is incorporating a lot of those understandings of religious freedom that had already been articulated and put into practice in colonies throughout British North America. Every colony had its own approach to these questions. You take a colony like Rhode Island, which had a strong dissenting tradition going all the way back to Roger Williams in the 1630s. He had been banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he was a little bit too much of a free thinker for those folks. He and Hutchinson and other dissenters found a haven in Rhode Island. So Rhode Island naturally had a very expansive conception of religious toleration. Massachusetts, conversely, retained an established church all the way into the 1830s. So religious freedom did mean something very different from colony to colony and from state to state in early America. But the fact that the First Amendment was created out of a collective recognition that religious diversity was sort of a foundation of American culture and that it had to be incorporated into the U.S. Constitution is highly significant. And so in this way, the church presents an ideal simply by existing and trying to get along. And even though that's a messy process and it's a fraught process filled with political conflict and there was plenty of animosity among the various Christian denominations in colonial America, ultimately that has a constructive purpose, which is to put into being some of our most important understandings of individual rights. And the First Amendment is case in point of that. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about the early abolitionist movement, which is another social force that is present by the mid-18th century. When we talk about the 19th century abolitionist movement, and we'll talk a little bit about that next week. We'll look at Frederick Douglass and some of the tremendous arguments that he made. But you can see abolitionism taking root much earlier than that. And here we have to look to the Quakers as an example. So, talk a little bit about this little fellow, Benjamin Lay. So in the 1730s and 40s, he would have been referred to as a dwarf. But he was indeed a little person. He's about 4 feet tall. He suffered from a condition called kyphosis, so he was also hunchbacked. And famously depicted in a painting here that was owned by Benjamin Franklin's wife, Deborah. He was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin's. And if you look at the trajectory of Benjamin Franklin's life with respect to slavery, we have somebody who believed in slavery earlier in his life. In fact, he had owned several slaves. But by the 1770s and 80s, he had become an abolitionist. And part of the reason for that is the activism of this fellow, Benjamin Lay. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin had actually published one of Lay's most notorious works, and I want to bring it up here. We can take a look at it. Now, this is back from the 18th century when nobody knew how to give anything a short title. So all the titles just go on and on and on. It's basically it's a summary of the entire work, in one long, convoluted, contorted sentence. Okay, I have that for you here. The other thing is, all the S's look like F's in Old English, and so I didn't want to read it right off the screen. I actually wanted to read it in translation, essentially. So this is the publication that Benjamin Franklin was willing to print for Benjamin Lay in 1738. All slave keepers that keep the innocent in bondage, apostates, pretending to lay claim to the pure and holy Christian religion, of what congregation soever, but especially in their ministers, by whose example the filthy leprosy and apostasy is spread far and near. It is a notorious sin, which many of the true friends of Christ and his pure truth, called Quakers, has been for many years and still are concerned to write and bear testimony against, as a practice so gross and hurtful to religion and destructive to government beyond what words can set forth, or can be declared of by men or angels, and yet lived in by ministers and magistrates in America. That's the title of the work. Yeah, that's it. So Benjamin Lay did not pull any punches. He was a ferocious orator. And another example of his approach was he would go from Quaker meeting house to Quaker meeting house. And he would always have some sort of, calling it performance art doesn't sound too off the mark here. There's one moment where, also in 1738, the same year this was published, he went into a meeting house in New Jersey. He brought a hollowed out book, which I think was supposed to resemble a Bible. He had filled it with pokeberry juice, so it was a blood red substance, and then he had a sword with him. And right in the middle of the meeting, he stood up, which you can do in a Quaker meeting, right? He got to say his piece, essentially took the book out, took the sword, plunged it into the book, splattering pokeberry juice everywhere, and then said, "Thus shall God shed the blood of those persons who enslaved their fellow creatures." At which point then the mortified congregation had him escorted out as quickly as possible, which by the 1740s was a regular occurrence for Benjamin Lay. He had this happen in so many different Quaker communities that it sort of became one of his pastimes. And if he didn't get that kind of reaction, then he would know that he had failed somehow to prick the consciences of his Quaker co-believers. The truth of the matter is that Benjamin Lay was a convert to abolitionism, like a lot of Quakers were in the 1730s and 40s and 50s. The title of his work is a little misleading because he suggests that the Quaker community is unanimous in its abhorrence of slavery. Far from the case. And in fact, Benjamin Lay got his first acquaintance with slavery when he was a merchant in Barbados. And he came to realize, wait, a lot of Quaker merchants are profiting off of the slave trade, either directly in the commerce of human beings or because they were trading goods that were connected to the commerce in human beings, right? Anybody who did commerce in molasses or rum was absolutely implicated in the slave trade. And so when Benjamin Lay's conscience is pricked, he then has the opportunity to start working on his fellow Quaker religionists, and that's what he does throughout the 1740s. And by the 1750s, he had started to despair of this because I guess he'd been kicked out of pretty much every Quaker meeting house that he could find. And he started to fear that maybe it was a lost cause. And the last years of his life were sad ones. He ended up living more or less as a hermit, sort of on the fringe of civilization, and didn't know if his work would bear fruit. But you need look no further than someone like Benjamin Franklin to realize that his work indeed bore fruit. And for Franklin to head up the Abolitionist Society of Pennsylvania by the 1780s was a sign of just how powerful this religious witness could be. His congregations were the first congregations in British North America to have white and black people worshiping side by side. They were empowering black preachers. And some of those congregations were actually starting to expel members who treated their slaves cruelly, and some were even urging them to start emancipating their slaves. In fact, when you look at the time of the Revolution in the 1770s and the 1780s, it was not uncommon to find recent converts in Methodist churches, in Baptist churches, who were voluntarily emancipating their enslaved people, not as a matter of law, but as a matter of conscience. So there's no question that fringe communities like the Quakers, like the Baptists, played an instrumental role in putting that issue of abolitionism on the table. It doesn't come to fruition fully, of course, until the 19th century, and yes, a war needed to be fought over this question, but you wouldn't have had an abolitionist movement in the 19th century had not its forebears already started to act powerfully on this. And eventually, of course, the Anglicans do get with the program. It took a little bit longer. The Anglicans were not on the front lines of this struggle until later on. But thank goodness for the Quakers and the Baptists and some of these other communities. It's not an easy road, and it is worth noting that those moments of abolitionist fervor that you would see in some of these Baptist congregations in the 18th century had largely tapered off by the 19th century, and even before the Cotton Revolution, which of course completely transformed Americans' attitudes with respect to slavery. In the 19th century, a lot of those Baptist congregations had actually retreated from their commitment to racial equality and were starting to buy into prevailing white supremacist values. So it's not necessarily a happy story in that regard, but what you get are glimpses of what is possible. And those can later be acted upon by activists and people interested in producing political change. The churches that were doing this in the 18th century played a vital role in giving us examples of what we could aim for at our best. Okay, so seeing how we're doing here on time. I want to wrap up today, and then just with a couple tentative conclusions, okay, and then we might have some time for a couple of questions before we're done. What have we seen thus far? And these are insights that I certainly want to tease out more fully next week when we get to talk about the Reconstruction period, when we get to talk about women's suffrage. But we see a couple things right off. One of which is that we can certainly believe that our rights come to us from God, that they exist prior to human society. So our rights are not granted by society. Our rights can be God-given, as is often explained to us. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a wonderful idea. But we also have to realize that to put rights into practice is hard work. It's often divisive work. There's no easy way to translate an abstract ideal into political reality. That requires a lot of heavy lifting. It requires social movements. It requires people to hash out compromises, such as the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was itself the product of a lot of political debate. So to say that our rights are God-given is not the end of the story. In fact, it's just the beginning of the story. How that's going to play out is a political question. It always is. It always will be. So we can't get discouraged, and we can't become fearful when the conflict becomes apparent. Right? That's all par for the course. And next week, when we talk about the abolitionist struggle and the Reconstruction period, we'll see. I mean, these conflicts tore a nation apart in the 1850s and 60s. So it's no mystery that there's political struggle at the heart of this. The second thing that we can start to get a glimpse of here, but I think we can see even more fully in the next couple weeks, is that the church's witness, the church's public involvement is always most effective when it can be supported by its example. The church being able to point to a life in common, we are already giving birth to these ideas. We can see it. It's happening right here. Completely transforms the efficacy of the public arguments that are made. A great example of this is what the Quakers were doing throughout the 1740s and 50s and 60s, as they were shifting their understandings from being okay with slavery, from even being pro-slavery in some instances, to being an abolitionist society. That was a lot of discernment. That was a lot of internal struggle, a lot of internal reckoning to get to a point where the Quakers could say with absolute conviction by the 1780s, you cannot be a slaveholder and a Quaker. So it's the work of people like Benjamin Lay who are facilitating that. Once the Quakers get to that point in the 1780s, you've got a powerful witness. For Benjamin Lay to say it in the midst of a society that was still convinced that slavery was entirely acceptable, morally and economically, it's an enormous transformation in the Quaker community. The work that the Baptists were doing, aborted as it was, right, by the early 1800s, was still instrumental in showing that there was another way that Christians could live their life in common, and to do so across racial lines instead of seeing white supremacy as the foundation of their Christian practice. Those are powerful moments. And when the church can give voice in that way to their shared ideals, to its shared ideals, Christians can do that in a really powerful way, a way that offers a gift to the wider society. It goes beyond just saying the right things. This has really to do with walking the walk as well as talking the talk, essentially. Okay, so maybe that's a good place to stop.
Can you all please, excuse me, join,
Questions?
I got so excited. Join me in thanking Troy for his wonderful, and I'm so grateful that he has kind of sketched out that tension between individual rights, which are God-given, and also community practices and beliefs and virtues, which are mediated through a community of faith. And you all are brilliant. We have about 9 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to ask questions. If you're going to make a 2-part question, make your question 2 parts. Give somebody else a chance to say it. And then if you are going to make a comment, just make it short. So Felix, we'll jump with you.
Thank you.
Troy, it's a wonderful presentation you've given us. I just wanted to offer the perspective that I'm Felix Rogers. I was a member of the Quaker Church for 10 years before my wife convinced me to come to Christ Church, and I went to Swarthmore College. I was a student there in the 60s, which meant it was celebrating 100 years of the founding of Swarthmore College in 1864. The black students had a sit-in that year, and one of their key points was that in spite of this abolitionist tradition, in the first 100 years of Swarthmore College, only 100 African American students were admitted to the school.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's a vivid reminder of how even the most committed of racial egalitarians throughout American history how hard a struggle it has been to really put those ideals into practice, and the church has fallen short in so many ways, you know. And as I was preparing for the talk, I was reminded that for every Christian abolitionist, there were far more pro-slavery Christians, right, throughout the 18th and 19th century. And that's true even going all the way up to the 1850s. My students are always astonished to find out that not everybody in the 1850s agreed with Frederick Douglass. Really? I mean, it's just so obvious. Everything he says is so brilliant and profound and obviously true, right? How do you deny what's right in front of you? And there remained so much work to be done in the 1950s and 60s, and we're not out of it yet, right? We're still looking at a lot of work that has to be done, and future generations will undoubtedly judge us in much the same way, right? It was right in front of them. How could they deny that it was so transparently obvious? So a little humility goes a long way here when we're trying to pat ourselves on the back and talk about how enlightened we are on some of these questions. It's a great example.
A question is, how do rights come out of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament?
Well, it's a great question because you'll search in vain for rights-based language in the Old Testament or New Testament, right? And I think to some extent it really does stem from a recognition that, you know, theologically speaking, we have to make a bit of a leap to get to a rights-centered conception of humanity. If God is our protector and provider and sustainer, what need do we have of rights? So there's a great book to be written, and I'm sure there have been quite a lot of accounts to try to explain this. My own research didn't really go there so much because I'm not really a biblical scholar by nature, and so when I was doing this research in the 90s, I started from the standpoint of American history and was looking at the way in which the rights language was there really from the very beginning, and there's a British tradition of, you know, that we're rights-bearing individuals that kind of goes all the way back to the Magna Carta, I suppose, but I'd have to defer to
Yeah,
Father
actually,
Bill on
I
this
did
one,
do
in
a
terms of-
study on this.
Yeah.
So just happen to know. So what you have to keep in mind is that the rights language you find in the Declaration of Independence that was written by Jefferson, but he basically summarized John Locke, who wrote in the Second Treatise of Government, published in 1688, that people had a right to life, liberty, and property. Now keep in mind that Locke writes that Second Treatise after he's written a first treatise, which was to deny the divine right of kings. So keep in mind that what Locke is trying to do is he's trying to say that this theology of the monarch, where the monarch is the territory, right? So Henry VIII said, "I am England," right? And that was actually a theology. The king's body was not just his physical body, but it was the body of the whole realm was the king. And there were elaborate rituals around that. It was all taken from the body of Christ in the Eucharist. When Jesus says, "I am," you know, when we read in Matthew 25, when we read anything where Jesus says, "You have to be members of my body," the king was the representative of Christ. And Christ and the body of the realm was the body of Christ. The body politic and the body of Christ were together. So when Locke says, each of us has an inalienable right to life, liberty, and property, what he is first talking about is we have a right given by God to ourselves, our bodies. And he's denying that
that connection between the monarch and the body of Christ, and partly because Locke is Protestant that he develops that. So the connection is really about our membership in a political body that's larger than any nation. Does that make sense? I moved really quickly there. So that what Jefferson does is he takes it from life, liberty, and property, he makes it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so he just makes a change. But all of that presupposes an idea of the whole, that our church is larger than our institutional body or even our nation. It's actually, we are in communion with everybody. So there's internal to that rights language is this gesture towards community that Troy is so excellently lifting up. Sorry for going on. Yeah.
Does Paul appeal to his rights as a
Roman citizen?
Okay,
Yeah.
so I was thinking of that example. Like when is the moment that I can think of in the New Testament where Christians were appealing to rights, and I don't know how that would translate. Right?
There isn't.
But he appeals to his status as a Roman so that he can go to Rome for his trial once he's arrested.
If you were actually to do it, you would probably look at, believe it or not, 1 Corinthians 12, right, when we are all members of one body, right? So what Locke is arguing is that the body that the king is claiming as his own is illegitimate. And the body that we share is not defined by our nationality or our ethnicity or our local communities or our territory. It's by God. And so that's the derivation, but it's not, there's not a moment where people exercise a right as like a trump card to end the card game, right? Which is what kind of how we've used it. Barry.
When you're talking about early America, you talk about the colonists and you talk about their Christianity. What's happened to the Native Americans? Are they part of the racial mix, or are they to be exterminated?
Well, no, they're not, right? It's another example where, there are some exceptions to this. There were some New England Puritan clergymen who were missionaries in reaching out to American Indians, but there was never a sense in which they could be treated as political equals. Even in the best moments, the most generous efforts to reach out to American Indians came from a position of cultural superiority. There was just an assumption that they're heathen, and we should still love them because they're God's creatures, but they could never be rights-bearing individuals like we are. And this is another one of those tragic moments where the church could have been different in approaching those communities. Yeah, and of course this tragedy continues all the way up to the present, but certainly was very visible throughout the 19th century as the expansion west took place. And some could argue that that's where American colonialism really starts, and the Christian churches provided justification for colonialism in the 17th century, in the 18th century, the 19th century with the war against Mexico and the war against Spain, where America finally became a colonial power when it acquired the Philippines, right? But yeah, you could trace that all the way from the very beginning. It's a sad reality, but I think it's true.
Please, Pastor.
Oh, that expression on her face is terrible right now. Yeah. Oh my goodness. The other way.
You know, I appreciated your kind and courageous attempt to tell us that we need to embody these values that we wish to present to the world, right? I think that's gorgeous. I think it's beautiful. I think it's an ideal. But I'm thinking about the scriptures, and I'm thinking that's actually not the norm. The norm are prophets, right? They are voices in the wilderness. They are crying out. The norm is the one who says the truth gets crucified. So I'm wondering, I mean, as much as I really appreciate the vision of us being together, and that would be ideal. You know, we want to be unified. We want to be the one and speak with one voice. I'm also wondering if that might be something that prevents us from actually doing our jobs as Christians, which is to speak out in the wilderness. So what are your thoughts on that?
They're not mutually incompatible. And in fact, I think if you look at the example of Benjamin Lay, you realize that the prophets are vital, because what the prophets are going to do is spur the community to reconsider its priorities, to go to the roots of the faith tradition and consider, what is God expecting of us now? And so what us ordinary non-prophets have to do is learn to listen to the prophetic voice and allow ourselves to be transformed. Unfortunately, Benjamin Lay had to be chased out of a lot of communities before he finally reached his vision. And again, he died in despair, right? He didn't think he'd made it. Look at Martin Luther King Jr., in his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, right? I may not get there with you, but God's going to bring you to your destination. So it is maybe an unfortunate thing that we need the prophetic voice to spur us from our torpor, our inattention to these things. But you're right, it has always worked that way. There always have to be those courageous folks that are willing to go there, and then hope that we follow.
We got to stop. Thank you, guys. Will you join me in thanking Troy again? Super job.